razor wire and stacked shipping containers have turned the Rio Grande in Eagle Pass into a fortress, a show of force meant to keep migrants out and to show Texas is in charge. But now, one Texas lawmaker is asking, has it gone too far? And from the border to the courtroom, what happens when immigration enforcement, national security, and constitutional law collide? As the National Guard deploys on U.S. soil, many are asking, are we protecting our borders or redefining the role of the military at home? And Texas is at the center of it all: power, policy, and the fight over who controls America's southern line. I'm Yami Virgin with Sinclair Broadcasting, and this is another edition of Immigration Crisis, the fight for the southern border. Our guest this week is Professor Jeffrey Korn from Texas Tech.
I'm a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel. I spent 17 years as a military lawyer, 6 years as a military intelligence officer before that.
How exactly does the National Guard, does the military decide where to be deployed to, especially with the protests going on tomorrow? Right now, they're saying they're going to be deployed in Austin. They haven't said San Antonio. How do they decide?
Well, normally that's coordinated with the governor's office and the director of public safety or local law enforcement agencies that need assistance. If it's a preventive deployment, in other words, pre-positioning forces in case something gets out of hand, then that would be coordinated through the governor's office, through the advocate general, who is the commanding general of the Texas National Guard. One thing's for sure, it's not a military officer doing this on their own. This is all going to be coordinated as part of a joint law enforcement, crowd control, or public safety plan that would be prepared ahead of time. And then what would happen is the advocate general, who's the commander of the Texas Guard, would go to his operational officers and logistics officers, and they would then come up with what military people call the scheme of maneuver to implement the course of action to make sure that you had the right forces at the right place at the right time.
So, talking about the right places, iconic places in Austin, in San Antonio, last time they were at the Alamo. Why are those picked? I know why, but if you could expand on it.
Well, that's an intelligence function. That's trying to predict where flashpoints will most likely, where there's a highest risk of a flashpoint. I mean, ideally, if you're going to deploy National Guard forces, they're going to be bored because you're going to have peaceful protest or demonstrations, which is a right protected under the First Amendment, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to petition government with your grievances. There's no right to engage in criminal activity. There's no right to attack government agents. There's no right to vandalize or deface public or private property. So hopefully these are just preventive measures to be at the right place at the right time in the event there's a problem. And there has to be some prediction going on of where that's most likely to occur. And that's probably where you would pre-position forces and also have a capability to move them rapidly to other areas if need be.
How is this any different than what they normally do? Because we're talking about staging in country, not in a war zone.
Well, this is a key mission of the National Guard. The National Guard is different than those soldiers at Fort Hood or out in El Paso at Fort Bliss or in Joint Base San Antonio, the active duty forces. Those forces don't have a significant public safety mission domestically. They can be called upon in an emergency by the president invoking certain statutory authorities. But the norm is that if there is a need to supplement civilian law enforcement capability for some type of domestic disturbance or domestic disaster, then the first choice is to call on the National Guard. That's part of their mission. So you say, well, it's not like they're deploying to another country. they also have that mission. They're different than active duty forces. They train for a domestic mission, and many of them enlist in the National Guard because they feel a pride in being able to support the governor and the state to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of the state of Texas, or when called upon to help other governors in other states to do that. So there's nothing really unusual about preparing for potential civil disturbance with the National Guard. And I know that's controversial. But you'd rather be prepared and not need to use the capability than unprepared and need to use it. Think of January 6th, right? We would have been much better off if the Guard had been pre-positioned and prepared to respond to that than having to respond after the fact. So I think citizens who are involved in lawful, peaceful demonstrations ought to acknowledge that there is a logical reason why you might see some forces in a staging area, and don't assume that it's calculated to be provocative.
Let me ask you, and now I'm going to continue with the stuff from my podcast. So, Cliff, you're done. Let me ask you what we're seeing right now happening with the National Guard going to Chicago, going to Oregon, to Portland to support the mission of the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that, because I mean,
Yeah.
we've seen the reaction people are having to this.
Yeah. So this is this is unprecedented. It's not unprecedented that National Guard units from one state will go to another state to help out, right? But that historically has been at the request of the other state. So, for example, if there's a tornado that rips through Oklahoma and you need National Guard forces to support a curfew, the governor of Oklahoma might go to the governor of Texas and say, we could really use help. And there are all sorts of pre-existing agreements for mutual support. What's unprecedented is that the president has taken control of the National Guard under a statute that allows the president to call the Guard into federal service when there's a rebellion against the United States, or there is a threat to the ability of the United States to execute the law. So the president has said that he thinks we're at that point. So he calls the National Guard into service. And instead of getting into a dispute with the governor of Illinois, who will say, I don't want you to take my National Guard, and face that legal challenge, he goes to a willing governor who says, I'm willing to let you use our National Guard for this mission. And so they're being deployed into another state under federal authority. It's not like Governor Abbott is directing the deployment. He's essentially giving the National Guard up to the president so the president can order their deployment to support the Department of Homeland Security. And because it's unprecedented, it's presenting real challenges for the courts that are responding to the governors of the unwilling states challenging the invocation. And what they're really challenging is the credibility of the president's assertion that the situation in those cities is of such dire levels that it's overwhelmed law enforcement capability and necessitates use of military capability. It's a very complicated issue, but it's something we've never seen before. And I'll give the administration credit. They're definitely creative in figuring out ways how to get a legal theory to get these forces from another state into Illinois, into Oregon. But there is, I think if what's good for the goose has to be good for the gander. So I think people in Texas ought to imagine 5 years from now, when maybe there's a different president in the White House who wants to do something in Texas with the National Guard that the governor doesn't want to do. And so he goes to the state of New York or the state of California, and they say, you can send our National Guard to Texas. And suddenly we have, against the will of the governor and the legislature, National Guard forces being deployed. I think there would be outrage in Austin over this, and I think it would be perceived as a breach of Texas sovereignty. And that's what these governors in these other states are essentially arguing. It's very complicated. But I do want to emphasize one point. Directing your anger or your discontent with this at the members of the National Guard who are doing their duty and obeying their orders, they don't pick their missions, to me is really scurrilous. direct your opposition to the government authorities that are making these decisions, but don't make them the target of your anger because they're not the ones who are choosing to deploy on these missions.
How difficult is it right now, do you think, for some, especially when you're moving the National Guard? And now we're hearing that they're moving Portland or Oregon National Guard down here to help with the border, and we're sending people up there to help with crime. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
Well, the decisions to send the decision to send Texas Guard to Illinois and California Guard to Oregon makes a lot of sense when you recognize that the president was blocked in federalizing the National Guard of those states by judicial decisions. So you have a court order that says we're not going to let you call the Illinois National Guard or the Oregon National Guard into service. And the judge who issues that order, I think, never contemplated that the president might say, fine, I'll go to another state and get their National Guard, which now becomes another issue they have to deal with. Logistically, hey, you know what? In some ways, there's some value to it because the process of mustering and deploying is a training opportunity. So, I mean, you can look at this in a number of different ways. The military and the National Guard can do the missions they're given. They'll be able to do it. They'll figure it out. They'll get to where they need to be when they need to be there. Having said that, I think that there are probably members of the Guard, and I haven't spoken with any, but I'm guessing there are members of the Guard who said, I signed up to serve in Texas for a domestic problem, not in Illinois. So, we have to think of other consequences. Recruiting. Are people going to be less likely to sign up for the Guard because they're worried they're going to be sent all over the country whenever there's a dispute between the president and another governor? Maybe some people like that. Maybe some people don't like it. I don't know. I don't think getting them there and getting them back is really the issue. I think the issue is the legal question of whether this is a legitimate and lawful invocation of the authorities Congress has vested in the president to use the National Guard in response to a genuine domestic emergency.
My last question to you would be, I mean, we have politics, we have sentiments, we all have our own feelings. We're the media. We're not supposed to have any feelings unless you're a commentator that makes $1 million a year. What's the job of the law? Lady, the justice always has that blindfold on her.
Well,
how's that going to work out?
In this context, it's very clear. The Constitution vested Congress in Article 1, Section 8 with the authority to provide for calling forth the militia to repel invasion and suppress insurrection. That was given to Congress. Congress has exercised that authority by enacting federal laws that delegate to the president the authority to call the National Guard into federal service in response to an invasion or a rebellion or a disorder that disables the ability to enforce federal law. That's the authority the president is invoking. The job of the courts is to look at the invocation, look at the objective facts, and make an assessment of whether the president is acting consistent with the statutory authority or whether he's abusing the statutory authority by creating a pretext that doesn't exist. And the cases that he's lost so far have been based on judges saying, you have not persuaded me that the factual situation on the ground satisfies the emergency requirements that Congress contemplated when it gave you this authority. I don't know if those cases are going to stand up on appeal, because when Congress delegates, when Congress says you can respond to a threat that endangers the implementation of federal law, they're giving the president broad discretion to decide what that looks like. And I think the appellate courts might say, look, if Congress thinks the president is being overzealous in the use of this authority, there's a simple solution. Congress amends the law. Congress puts more checks into the law itself. So this is really, all of the media has been focused on what the president is doing and what governors are doing, and we're all ignoring the real core issue here. are we really comfortable with the extent of the authority Congress has delegated to the president in this area? Or should Congress be more involved in deciding if, where, and when National Guard forces should be put in federal service to police the streets of the United States?
What's keeping you up?
Oh, what's keeping me up? I mean, there's a lot going on in Texas. If you're in a public university in Texas, there are issues now on, the legislature's laws and the governor's orders related to things you're supposed to not say, and people are worried about academic freedom. And I've been a very vocal critic of the president's theories of legality for attacking these boats in the Caribbean, and have received a good bit of hate email from people who don't like the fact that I'm contradicting the position of the administration. I mean, it was Mark Twain's famous quote that was, patriotism is loving your country always and your government when it deserves it. And nobody can question my patriotism, my love of this country, what I devoted to this country. But I think that requires you to make reasoned, rational critiques of government policy. The use of the military domestically, what keeps me up? One of the things that keeps me up is the chicken and egg problem. This is why I made the point that if you're at a protest in San Antonio and you see guard members pre-positioned, don't automatically assume that's deliberate provocation. What concerns me is it becomes a cycle. The more you put out on the street, the more anger there will be over it, the more confrontations will occur, which will provide more justification for it. And what historically has been a narrowly invoked exception, deploying military personnel to the streets of the United States as law enforcement agents, will slowly start to become more of an accepted norm. And that, to me, I think is very troubling. That's not the tradition of this country. I mean, part of the reason that the men who wrote the Declaration of Independence, people forget that was a grievance letter, right? The Declaration of Independence was a grievance letter to the king saying, here are the things we're complaining about. We need you to fix, or else we're going to have to declare our independence. And a major part of that was an overzealous use of the British military in domestic affairs. So it's inconsistent with our national tradition to make use of the military domestically the norm. We should see it as an exception. If that means you have to give civilian law enforcement more capability, more resources, fine. That's a legitimate debate to engage in. And that worries me a little bit, that as I've said a couple of times, you start to get the sense that the military has become one of the administration's favorite tools in the toolbox. And when your favorite tool is a hammer, guess what? Every problem starts looking like a nail.
Well, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. And I know you talked real quick about the operations that they're doing right now in the Caribbean. Can I ask you before we end the conversation, the intelligence that's needed to determine that a boat that's out in the Caribbean, it's not fishermen, it's
No,
not
it's beyond
migrants.
it's beyond that. It's the predicate issue, the initial question is it legitimate for the United States to say that the activities of a drug syndicate are an armed attack on the nation? And the government's theory, the administration's theory has been to analogize Tren de la Agua as to Al Qaeda because of the harm caused by drugs being smuggled into the United States. Now, I am not in any way underestimating that harm. I think they're a terrible group. I'm glad they've been designated a foreign terrorist organization. But to equate the harmful effects of narcotics being brought into the country by a group that's not trying to kill Americans, that'd be stupid. You want them to buy your product, right? To Al Qaeda that had the intent of killing and destroying Americans, to me is an invalid analogy. I don't think we're in common sense terms, I don't think it's legitimate to say we're at war with a drug cartel. We should be using law enforcement capabilities. We should never be even asking, are the members of that boat enemy belligerents or fishermen? We should be saying they're drug couriers. Let's interdict the boat, seize the narcotics, arrest the occupants, and bring them to justice. What we've been doing in the Caribbean for 30 years. If you want to read my thoughts on this, you can Google today. I have a post on, it's on a website called War on the Rocks. So just War on the Rocks in my name, and you'll get my analysis of this.
Thanks again to Professor Korn. Now an update on Shelby Park and Eagle Pass, once the epicenter of the immigration crisis during the Biden administration. For years, miles of razor wire and shipping containers have lined the Rio Grande in Eagle Pass, part of Texas' hard push to secure the border. Now, a South Texas lawmaker says it's time to start taking some of it down. State Representative Eddie Morales Jr. sent a letter to Governor Greg Abbott asking the state to remove what he calls remnants of Operation Lone Star. In that letter, Morales says that while those barriers may have once been necessary, they've now become, quote, outdated and unnecessary. It all started when the city of Eagle Pass and Texas Department of Transportation engineers tried to inspect the international bridges in that city, but couldn't get to the pillars because of the razor wire and thick brush. The Eagle Pass Fire Department had to take them all by boat just to get the job done. That moment, Morales said, highlighted a bigger issue that it's time to restore a sense of normalcy for the people who live along the border. He's also calling on the governor to reopen the river access points and bring Eagle Pass and Shelby Park back to their community. Morales reminds the governor he actually supported Operation Lone Star when it began, when migrant crossings were surging, but says things are different now. Crossings have dropped, and state resources are increasingly being used to support federal agents rather than build new barriers. Our colleague Jordan Elder reached out to the governor's office. They made it clear they are not backing away from their border strategy. Their statement reads, quote, Texas deployed every tool and strategy available to stop illegal immigration under former President Biden. Thanks to these strategies and President Trump's decisive leadership to close the border, illegal crossings are at a record low. Texas will not relent in its mission to secure the border and protect Texans and Americans, end quote. That's all for this week's segment of Immigration Crisis, the Fight for the Southern Border. I'm Yami Virgin in San Antonio, Texas, for Sinclair Broadcasting, where we continue to be the eyes and ears of the southern border. Until next time.